Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Luke Homer is an independent producer, writer, and director whose work ranges from scientific reductionism to imaginative spiritual explorations aiming to identify and fulfill fundamental human needs unmet by modern society. In their new book, On the Origin of Being, Understanding the Science of Evolution to Enhance Your Quality of Life, Jenny Powers, Ph.D., and Luke Homer offer to answer the question of how we evolved from hunter-gatherers and the lessons that we can apply today. Powers and Comer claim that whenever humans lived in accord with their evolutionary design, they are more likely to experience greater physical and psychological health, and thus a good life. Through meticulous research, the authors trace our evolution from single-cell organisms back billions of years ago through primates, hominids, and all the way to modern humans, showing the origins of our many behaviors. They then show how modernity tends to disrupt those natural behaviors and explain how you can reclaim your primal self, even as you enjoy the benefits of the modern world and a life of health, well-being, and the fuller expression of our humanity. Luke Homer, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. And I would like for everyone to know that I've been working on this project and similar projects for 15 years in the background while I was basically pursuing another career. And this will be my first time to speak publicly on these subjects. So I'm excited and a little nervous.
That is amazing. Boundless Body Radio. You heard it here first. That is such an honor. I did not know that at all. And thank you so very much for doing it. The honor to you.
Hold on, Casey. You just broke up again. I would like to
announce no worries.
That I am in Boulder, Colorado, in the middle of a hailstorm now. Casey tells me the audio is still good, but it kind of sounds like my house is falling in on my head right now.
Yeah, we may have some audio issues. So far, so good.
You were breaking up. There was a hailstorm, so I missed the question.
No worries. I just wanted to thank you for doing the honor of hosting you the first time on a show to be able to talk about this. I have to say, it doesn't surprise me one little bit that you've put that much time into your research to be able to do your book and all the other projects you've had. Just looking into them a little bit, I have to admit, I'm not all the way done with the book, but the part that I've read so far is very, very, very well done. And I can tell it is very meticulously researched, like we said in the introduction. So kudos to you and all the work that you put into that.
Thank you.
Super cool. Now, before we get into some of the topics we're going to be talking about today, you also sent me a video that you did talking about your own personal health story, which I found to be very, very interesting. Can you tell us some of the details of your journey through personal health as well and how you ended up where you are today?
Yeah, for me, it happened with good old mom. I was born and raised in small towns in Alabama where everybody was eating junk food and fast food. But my mother was pretty adamant that we eat brown bread, beans, Gulf Coast seafood, fresh local vegetables, lots of peaches, lima beans, okra, black-eyed peas. And I think at that point, she kind of subconsciously imparted this message to me that eating with nature is a good thing. So I had a pretty strong basis in food and nutrition with my mother. But then later in life, I went to boarding school. I kind of lost sight of that, started eating crap like everybody else. Then kind of maybe continue that pattern somewhat through college. Even though I was an athlete, I was eating as much pizza as everybody else and drinking my share of beer and that sort of thing. But then jump forward into my 20s. I was a pretty sort of radical person. I lived and worked in the wilderness for 3 years, running wilderness courses for adjudicated teenagers. I was doing a lot of extreme sports. I was rock climbing here in Colorado, skiing, including backcountry skiing. I was a windsurfer during that time. And I was very much sort of at odds with modern sort of mainstream American culture. And at some point, I just started breaking down, like physically got weak. I used to, be able to run 7 or 8 miles, and then I was struggling to run a mile. I was losing interest in my sports because they were causing too much harm to my body. And it was worse than that because I would go nights, like 2 nights in a row without hardly sleeping at all. And then a lot of sort of anxiety started kicking in, and then depression, and then sort of an existential crisis. And really, even I would say a full-fledged nervous breakdown. Right when everybody else is starting their careers and their families, I'm ending up kind of in this bad place. So I went through the usual mechanisms to heal myself, went to the doctors, blood test, blah, blah, blah. They said, take this pill. I said, no, I'm not going to take this pill. And then at some point, I just made a full realization that if anybody was going to save myself, it was going to be me. And that's kind of how I am naturally, that, I am in control of my own destiny and I will figure this out. So that launched me on my own healing journey. And I've listened to some of your guests on this podcast and other guests on other podcasts, and that seems to be a pretty common pattern, that the reason people get interested in this is because they hit like some kind of bottom, and then they look for conventional ways to heal themselves, and they're like, well, excuse me, but fuck this, I want to take another path. So that's what I did. And it was an unusual path at that point. It was, psychotherapy, it was psychedelics, it was festival culture, it was meditation, yoga. I got into this very unusual form of dance called contact improv. I got into trance dancing, even more trips into the wilderness, that kind of thing. And somewhere in there, I kind of landed on food and nutrition for me as being one of the best ways to heal myself, because I felt I was getting the most constant and long-term benefits from that. So at first I didn't know what I was doing, of course, because I didn't study food and nutrition in school or anything. So I read a bunch of the books, The Zone, the Atkins, the South Beach, the this, the that, anything of these popular things, just kind of whizzed through them. I also experimented with a variety of diets, sometimes for months at a time, and not only just one of them, but probably altogether 5 or 10 different ones. And then I got more interested in kind of the anthropology of food and nutrition, what people ate in the past as foragers, hunter-gatherers, what they ate as agriculturalists, how the diet transitioned over time. And then it got even a little bit weirder, because then I got interested in primate nutrition. And then somewhere in there, I started studying the biochemistry of food and nutrients, which is basically, what is a nutrient? What does it look like? What is its form? How does it digest in our body? And then how does it function in our body? And then finally, I was always interested in evolutionary theory. So I had all this information about diet, anthropology, the history of it, the biochemistry, but what is the framework that holds all this together? And for me, that was basically the theory of evolution. So this was all kind of this mental cogitations that I was doing on my own, pretty much, in the background when I was living the rest of my life. And at some point after, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 different years, it all formed into a project, which I call the First Supper. And then that's a project that I've literally been working on for 10 years or longer, I suppose. And I confess that I have not, there's 2 books in development. One of them is pretty much finished, but not quite. But my point is, when I was working on that project, I was hiring periodically research assistants to help me. And then Jenny Powers, the co-author of this book, applied for that job. And then I looked at her background. She had a strong history, Ph.D. in biology, had been a bench scientist, was very impressive resume for sure. And I'm like, man, I'd really like to hire this person, but they don't have the specific skills or knowledge base that I need for this particular project. So I went to Jenny and I said, well, how about working on this other project? And that is, again, on the origins of being. So the first supper is how evolution designed you to eat. And the subtitle of this book is Understanding Scientific Evolution to Enhance the Quality of Your Life. So while researching evolution, food, and nutrition, I realized that what I was applying to food and nutrition also applied to sleep, circadian rhythms, work patterns, rest patterns, certainly food and nutrition, of course, relationship with nature. It also applied to social patterns, cultural patterns. And it's like you said in the intro, that when we live in accord with our evolutionary design, even in the modern world, we're more likely to experience well-being. And when we live in discord with that, we are more likely to experience pathology, physical pathology, outright illness, psychological pathology, which I struggled with for quite a while. And then you can see it all over the place, social and cultural pathology as well. So this book is not saying, hey, let's go back and live like cavemen. It's basically saying, hey, we're in this modern world and it's pretty cool, but we have to accept our biological design and shape this modern world as best we can to account for our biological design. And if we do that, well, it's going to be a lot better.
Wow. Well, you did such a good job in that book. I'm so fortunate that you sent me a copy, which I really, really appreciate. It's interesting to hear your background in all of the nutrition, and obviously that is very interesting to you as it is to me. And we'll have lots of questions about nutrition. But the book does start with sleep and circadian rhythms. What was it? I mean, why did you decide to start the book about sleep before getting into more of the nutrition subject?
Well, believe it or not, there's actually 2 more books in this series that are already written. We wrote it as 1 book, and then the publisher said, hey, this is too long. Nobody's going to read it. You got to break it down into 3 books. So we did that. So the first book is on the basics of our biology. And there's nothing more basic than sleeping and waking. And the basic point of circadian rhythms is that life evolved on this planet with the sun coming out during the day and it getting dark at night. And this basically set up an internal clock called circadian rhythms in all living things. It's in bacteria, it's in eukaryotes, single cell organisms. It carries through to plants, to animals, to primates, all the way to humans. So we look at the origins of all of that, and then look at it closely in primates, especially chimpanzees, especially regarding sleep and waking patterns, and then look at it as much as we can through human evolution, which is hard because we don't necessarily have a lot of data. But then we look at, human foragers, ones that have been studied, that we have records about, how they slept, how they woke. And then we look at how it kind of started to transition during agriculture. And then you get to modern times, and there's a pretty, in some cases, substantial disruption. And then it comes down to that same old pattern. When you find disruptions in circadian rhythms, you find a greater probability of disease because you're living out of whack with your internal clock. When you're living more in accord with your circadian rhythms, again, you find greater health. And the biohackers, they all know this now. They came to it from a different angle, from their modern day studies. We're coming from saying, well, that's great. We appreciate all that. But hey, just look at your biological design and you can figure most of this stuff out. But with that being said, we humans do have variations in our circadian rhythms that are supposedly genetic based. I don't know if that's a hard fact at this point, but there's certainly research being shown that there's kind of 4 different genetic subsets, ranging from people who, go to bed at sunset and then wake up before sunrise, and then people who go to bed an hour after sunset, blah, 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 on down the line, to even the night owls. But a night owl in modern society might mean you're up till 4 a.m. in the morning. But in terms of genetic design, night owl basically means you're still up maybe at 11 p.m. or midnight, and then you're going to wake up at 7 or 8. And I happen to be a night owl. So,
Okay.
but
Interesting. Now, I had heard that we evolved different sleep cycles, like you're describing. Some people have different, if you want to call them like sleep phenotypes or whatever, because it would be more likely that if you were in a hunter-gatherer tribe, at least one person and maybe more might be awake for the better part of the 24-hour cycle. Is that something you're aware of or can confirm?
oh, that's in our book. It's indeed in the book. I'm about 100% certain of that. That yes, the idea is that if you're living as a hunter-gatherer in a small village, probably not great if everybody's asleep at the same time, because then, a predator could come or a neighboring enemy tribe could come, and then you would be in trouble. So it makes a lot of sense that we would evolve to have different cycles of waking and sleeping so that we could have, more or less a permanent watch, so to speak.
Interesting. Yeah, I find that very interesting. And you brought up something really important that often gets missed. We talk about sleep quality, and we know about blue light blocking glasses or the curtains that block out light, and we want to try to make a dark environment for our sleep. But we don't often think of the sunlight during the day and how important that is to set that circadian rhythm like you're describing. And it's a because so those of us living in the northern environment, this is the day of the longest amount of sunlight in the day. Can you talk about why that sunlight is so important to then set the circadian rhythm that then helps us with our sleep later on down the road?
Yeah, the general recommendation in the book is that as soon as you wake up, you go out and get direct sunlight in your face. And then a lot of biohackers have confirmed that on that same thing through other means. And then what that does is help set their circadian rhythms, and then also underlying hormones and other things that set you up for the activity of the day. Whereas if you don't get that initial sunlight, then you're more likely to be drowsy, your circadian rhythm is going to get unset, and then it might even possibly lead to disrupting your sleep cycle later in the night. And that is, for me, the first thing I do is that I have historically not been a morning person because I'm a bit more of a night owl. And I've tried different things, but the thing that just works for me, especially in the warmer months, is waking up and this going direct out into that sunlight. And then I walk about a half mile to a coffee shop and get a little bit of caffeine, and then walk back uphill. So I get a little bit of physical motion going. And then I work in 90-minute blocks. I work in a 90-minute block and then take a break, and then, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is key. And then throughout the remainder of the day, I think it's a good idea to get continuous sunlight as much as you can. That is, get outside and take a walk when you can. And then there's, we don't have this in our book, but there's some biohacking evidence that actually being in the sun at twilight, when the sun is setting, also helps set your body up for going to sleep later that night. Because, basically you're getting a message, hey, the day is coming to an end. It's time to start kicking in the melatonin or whatever, and then, settle in for sleep.
Yeah, I've heard that research as well, and it makes a lot of sense that the lower horizon light that's more red would signal more bedtime. That's where fires are on the ground, and it's a red light versus the big bright blue light that's up on above us all day. I've had circadian rhythm researchers say even the direction of the light entering our eyeballs is important. So that does make sense as you're talking about the sunlight and that the sunset helping us to prepare us for sleep. So I really appreciate that. I'm glad you wrote about that in the book. I love the diagrams that show how much sunlight we used to get versus how much the modern man gets, and knowing that the way they get it is probably through glass anyway, where you're saying it's best to be getting it outside. It's completely different, isn't it?
It is very, very different, and I can confirm that. By the nature of my work, especially right now, probably at least 7 or 8 hours a day in front of a computer. That is by necessity. I break that up by getting outside, but sometimes I put that computer away, and there is, within a short matter of time, an overall improvement in mood and sense of well-being just because I'm not staring at this alien light source. And then a quick note, as you probably know, is that you can set your monitor to go from blue to more reddish light at certain times during the day. I certainly do that. The other thing I do is that I set up my monitor as much as I can with a black backdrop. So my Word documents and other docs are black with the letters being white. So I'm not getting this sort of artificial white light in my face all the time.
Hmm.
And I
It's a good
find
idea.
that, yeah, well, it's just a simple little, I think it's in settings or somewhere, and then it'll apply to many of your applications.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really great idea. I always run my phone on dark mode, and I always have the sunset to sunrise setting on the warmest setting I can possibly go. So it's very, very little blue. And if I need additional, like I'll try to wear blue blockers. The best thing, like you said, is just close the laptop at a certain time. Try to turn off Netflix at a certain time, regardless of how addictive the series you're watching is. It sets up such better sleep. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, I never considered changing the color of the Word documents. That's a great idea.
And then there's also, I don't think we don't cover this subject in our book, but I've read about it that getting sunlight on the skin, well, we all know it produces vitamin D. We also know that it is a certain amount of danger because it can create oxidative damage to the skin, leading to skin cancer. It's just a fine balance there between your protective parts of your skin and the vulnerable parts of your skin. But there's also a considerable amount of research that's showing sun on the skin improves mood, well-being. I can't remember like specifically, it's a long list of 7 or 8 things. I don't want to misspeak, but it's an easy kind of Google search to also see that, yeah, you don't want to go out and burn your skin, but you do want to get sun on your skin, and that will have additional benefits. And as long as you're not damaging or burning your skin, you're not really necessarily increasing your risk of skin cancer.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Could not agree more. Like we said earlier in this conversation, it is the summer solstice, and it's about an hour past solar noon, when the sun is directly above on the day that it's going to be the furthest north. This would not be the best day if you haven't been exposed to the sun to go out in the afternoon and do a bunch of gardening and fry yourself. Not a good idea. That said, you can start either earlier in the year or earlier in the day when the sun is lower on the horizon. And yes, you want to expose your skin. And the very, very, very last thing we'd ever want somebody to do is apply what is it called? It's sunscreen. Sunscreen.
Yeah.
Do not use sunscreen. Use shade. Use hats. Use long sleeves if you have to. Like, do anything besides using sunscreen, please.
Well, I do follow this guy. I'm not vegan, but I like to hear alternative perspectives. Dr. Greger, I think is his name. Do you know him,
Yeah,
Dr. Greger, the vegan
I
guy?
do.
Everybody knows him, right? Well, he did put out a video recently that was a little shocking. And the gist of it, and this is factual, I remember this quite well, is that the There are a couple of compounds in well, first of all, they found that sunscreen with those compounds does block certain wavelengths of light, but it doesn't necessarily block all the harmful wavelengths of light. So the problem is that you can go out sun, like you're saying, middle of the day in Utah at high elevation with sunscreen on and think you're protected when you're not. So in that case, you're really possibly really damaging your skin. Whereas if you just don't use sunscreen at all and wear a hat and a shirt, then you're much better off. And the second part of that is that they're now finding, well, gee whiz, these chemicals with such weird sounding names that I can't even say them are actually leaching into the blood. And then, oh, sorry, we forgot to test if they are generally regarded as safe or not. So we really don't know because we thought the manufacturer would do that for us. So, I mean, I think they're basically kind of saying that titanium and zinc is safe, but like whatever on that. I think we have the same strategy on exposure to the skin. Don't be stupid. Build up your own defenses. And then, I mean, generally for me in Colorado, 6,000 feet, middle of the summer, going to avoid midday direct sunlight on my skin, but I'm out at 10 or 11 or 4 or 5. And I think at high altitude, you have to be especially careful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Luke, we are going to send you a medal for coming on to a more like pro carnivore show and finding something that we and Dr. Michael Greger agree on. That is amazing. Thank you so much. I love that. Goes to show we all have so much in common at the end of the day. It's great.
Well, Dr. Greger, man, that guy's like the biggest proselytizer ever. I really respect his work, but he's like hardcore vegan. This is the way it is, and
Yeah.
the only way, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay.
Well, that's a perfect segue actually into nutrition. I don't see a lot of other species on Twitter trying to figure out what they should be eating. I don't see a lot of other species debating whether they should be eating squirrels or whether they should be eating grasses. And as somehow as humans, we get so confused about what we should be eating. And now we have, even what I would consider what I do is a carnivore diet. It's an extreme diet. You have the polar opposite of people that don't eat any animal products. I don't eat any plant products. We have everything in between that people can consume. It's quite wild out there that we've gotten here as a species. How can we use our from your research, how can we use our evolutionary background and understand how we evolved to help us understand how we can adapt to where we should be eating today?
Wow, that's a huge question, Casey. I actually didn't realize that you are a strict carnivore after watching some of the podcasts and videos. That's interesting to me. And that is a complicated question, but you are right. When an animal is in nature, they don't know the difference between a carb or a protein or a fat, right? They can't even conceive of that, but somehow they just know what to eat. And they're not eating everything. They're eating things very selectively. All animals are basically doing that. There's some plants that'll kill them, and they know to avoid those. There's some plants that, are higher in protein, so they know to go to those. They know, but how do they know all of that? So clearly for them, it's an instinctual process, full of feedback loops. And this is not something I'm expert on, even though I know something about it. Those feedback loops are from all over the place. There's the enteric nervous system, which is, I think, the nervous system in your gut. It's basically reading what nutrients are coming in, and then whether or not you need more. There's hormonal systems that indicate, well, I'm full, or no, I'm not full and I need to eat more, or maybe systems that are saying I need more of this and more of that. There's also messages from the brain and also from the colon that are coming in. And then additionally, there's taste. if something tastes too bitter to an animal, bitter almost always indicates that something is toxic. They'll avoid it or they'll minimize it. They won't eat too much of it. If something tastes sweet, they eat more of it if they somehow are getting this message that they need more glucose or something. Some animals actually can taste individual amino acids. Humans can't. But some animals, there's some experiments showing that maybe mice or rats can selectively choose foods with certain amino acids in them, evidently to try to balance out their intake of amino acids to get something that's more complete. So there's very little research done on how all of that works, but I think it's very clear to say that all animals do have these systems that just tell them what to eat, and they're living in their natural environment, so it all works. Now jump ahead to humans. We do indeed have most of these systems in place. I would say in the modern world, we can't use them very well, or there's easy for them to break down. We're getting multiple messages from here and there. We're generally stuck in our head, so maybe we're not in touch with our instincts and our hormones as much. And then we're getting marketing messages, conflicting messages, et cetera, et cetera. And then at the end of the day, it's easy for us to get confused and then for that whole system to basically break down. Now, outside of maybe reading my books and listening to your podcast and many other podcasts and learning about the subject, probably the best thing you could do for your diet is isolate yourself to some extent, set up your kitchen so it has natural foods in it that have been treated and processed in the right way, and then just be like an animal and follow your instincts. I feel like I need this, or man, I ate this the other day and that made me feel really good. And then maybe try to get in touch with those natural instincts. And I think truly a lot of people are doing that. I know a lot of people who are very healthy later in life who probably don't understand much about nutrition, but you can tell that they're very selective about what they eat.
Yeah.
So, we should really try to reclaim that part of ourselves. But truthfully, it gets even weirder and more complicated than that, because humans are not universally adapted to one diet. A deer, ruminants, they all eat pretty much the same thing. Chimpanzees from one region to another, very similar. Carnivores, obviously, we know what they eat. But when you look at the history of the human diet through foraging and agricultural times, it ranges like incredibly from pretty much strict carnivory to what you eat to omnivorous diets with a pretty high percentage of plants. And that's why this subject is so confusing, because we can adapt to different diets. You can eat a carnivorous diet and be healthy, but you could still, if you decided, hey, I want to eat an omnivorous diet, you're still going to be alive, right? You're not going to die.
Exactly.
You can adapt, and I could tell you how you would adapt. But then that raises the question, well, what is the best diet and what is better? And, and is it personal choice, or is, and then you consider that you may have evolved from herders. I don't know your ancestry, but maybe it's Scotland. And for, generations, your ancestors were herding beef and cattle and sheep, and eating primarily dairy. We all have Mongolian blood in us, if we're European, because so it's a, but then, like my ancestry, well, I'm actually Great Britain, but everybody thinks I'm from the Mediterranean. So I don't know, like, what does that mean? But My ancestors could have eaten an entirely different diet. But the question is, do I have different genes from you? That's called nutrigenetics. You know, do we have unique adaptations to particular diets based on our evolutionary ancestry? And, you know, nutrigenetics is a formal area of study, but it's not very well developed at all, from what I can tell. And we're just basically in the infancy of that. And I haven't specialized on that, but I've certainly read around on it and researched around on it. And I just basically came to the conclusion that this is a badly neglected area of study that might be causing a tremendous amount of harm to humans because they think, well, I'm supposed to be eating this kind of diet, when in fact you're genetically adapted to a whole nother type of diet and you live your whole freaking life that way.
That's right. Yeah.
And one thing for sure, none of us are particularly adapted to eating high amounts of refined carbohydrates. We all know that, right? But, you know, 40–50% of Americans are still probably eating that diet. And they're going to get the diseases of civilization. Almost, it's just going to happen sooner or later. But they don't know not to do that yet.
That's right. Yeah. And your book does such a great job of linking those diseases of civilization. You can see how all of them are all related to each other. When we go to the doctor, they might talk about them as isolated things when they're all just symptoms of the same issue, which is whatever it is that we choose to do with diet. We've moved away from whole foods and now we're eating so much ultra processed nonsense that these companies are selling us. Of course, our health is going to suffer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, totally. So there are big fixes to the American diet that we can pretty easily execute and then see miraculous improvements in our health. And then there are fine-tuned adjustments based on, again, you know, our evolutionary ancestor or nutrigenetics. There's another confusing factor, which I shouldn't probably mention, but that's epigenetics as well. And that is that when we live a certain lifestyle, we might get these little markers on our genes that cause some genes, excuse me, my house cleaners, they cause that trigger some genes to turn on and others to turn off. So this subject of nutrition is way more complicated than people think. And that's probably why I worked on it for 15 years without actually ever publishing anything, because I was always somewhat confused. But at this point, you know, I've acknowledged, well, Luke, you're not going to figure all this stuff out. You got to start publishing your books, dude. You can't just sit on this stuff forever.
Dude, I'm like you. I've been obsessed with this stuff for years and years and years. You could just keep spinning and spinning and spinning and spinning. It's a very vexing but fascinating topic for sure that could suck you in at some point. You're right. You just got to get it out there.
Right.
So I do want to ask, in our evolution, this is just the way I understand it. So you can correct me or confirm your beliefs on this. One of the things that made humans very unique was our ability to control fire, and thus we could not only use fire to maybe scare off prey or use it to smoke foods or whatever. We use that fire to cook foods, and in that way we could unlock more nutrients. We could make nutrients more bioavailable to us, and we could also help detoxify some of the toxins that are in plants. Is that also the way you understand it?
Yeah, I can add a bit more context based on my research.
Please, that'd be
But
great.
it's interesting to note that studies have shown that chimpanzees have a basic understanding of fire. So when they're, Casey, you froze. Are you still there? Yeah, there you go. Hold on.
Still here, yeah.
Okay. The chimpanzees have a basic understanding of fire. That is, when there's a brush fire, they know how to get out of the way, right? They're not going to run straight into it. They know which way the wind's blowing, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's research also showing, oddly enough, that chimpanzees will go through brush fires and find cooked pieces of food and eat it. Which shows a little bit of an origin there of fire. And then jump ahead to scientific experiments done years later. And there's some experiments out there showing that some animals, given a choice between their native raw food or cooked food, they'll actually eat the cooked food.
Wow.
And I mean, scientists are not giving a strict answer as to why that is, but I think the best theory is that this is a bit of a confusing point, but that animals have a drive to get food that is easier to digest. And cooked food is generally partially digested. That's because, well, they spend less energy digesting it, and then they use more of the energy in the food for other purposes in their body, which then gives them a survival advantage. They have more energy, they thrive, they survive, they hunt, they forage better, that sort of thing. And then that tendency towards more refined foods extends through, I mean, I think largely the animal kingdom to some extent, and certainly through our own evolution. Now, at some point in our evolution, what probably happened was the brush fire. We were eating the cooked food. Some guy said, hey, look here, I got a limb or something, and we can take this and keep this fire going for a long period of time, and this would keep us warm, and we can maybe start doing some rudimentary cooking on it. And then it kept the predators away, and everybody thought this was a great idea. They even made a movie about it, Quest for Fire, a fantastic movie.
Oh, I'll have to look that up.
Watch that. It's kind of funny. It's a bit of a spoof on the caveman. But then, the fire would go out, and then, that would really suck. So sooner or later, they learn how to continuously cook to keep the fire going by actually making fire. So that's what that movie was about, Quest for Fire. You had all these kind of like different sort of hominoids, and then their fire goes out. Everybody freaks out. And then these two guys, these kind of funny guys, go out looking for fire, and they actually bring it back, and then there's a huge celebration. And anyway, at some point, probably about the time of Homo erectus, we were able to make fire and therefore use it permanently. And then cooking food does several things. It denatures proteins. So proteins are like these three-dimensional things, as you know, that are all folded up. But when you cook them, they flatten out. And then it's just a chain of amino acids. And then you can come in and more easily digest those amino acids into individual amino acids. So that saves you some digestive energy. Secondly, cooking tends to gelatinize carbohydrates, engorge them with water, break some of the bonds, also making them easier to digest. What cooking does to fat, it's a little less clear. Depends on the heat and the time of cooking. In some cases, it doesn't appear that cooking does much of anything to fats, but I think that's a question that's still kind of out there. The other thing that cooking does is deactivates plant toxins to an extent. So all the foods we eat now are cultivated, and we cultivate them to remove the toxins and to some extent the anti-nutrients. That was just a natural process that happened. Basically, toxins taste bad, so we selected for foods that were not bitter, and then we cultivated those foods and then cultivated more and more of the bitters out, so the toxins fell out. But when you live out in the wilds and you're eating wild food, it's just loaded with toxins and anti-nutrients and things that'll kill you. So there are a lot of plants that you can't eat. But if you cook them, and especially if you cook the smithereens out of them, you do largely deactivate those anti-nutrients, which then meant we could eat a greater range and amount of plants. So all of this in turn then allowed us, and you see this with Homo erectus, the teeth shrank because we didn't have to chew raw food, the jaw shrank, the gut shrank tremendously between, say, Australopithecus and Homo erectus. Homo erectus is a skinny kind of guy like us, even skinnier. And his predecessors were like more like big, bulky, kind of big stomach kind of animals. So it shrunk the gut. And then, and then the conventional theory is that you then were kind of extracting more nutrients out of your food with less energy. And then you could use more of those nutrients for other part of your body. And then most of that, in our case, went to our brain. So we had more basically nutrients available to our brain, which allowed our brain to expand in size. So from like Australopithecus, who is early in Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, who's early in on our evolution, our brain is 3 times as big. From Homo erectus to Homo sapien, I think maybe 40% bigger, something like that. And it's very unlikely that we would have expanded a larger brain unless we cooked and then did other things with food. And some of those other things is that as we got smarter and smarter, we also learned how to store food. I mean, squirrels store nuts and some animals store, but it's very limited. And but assumably, as we got smarter and we cooked, we could say, for example, render fat, separate the protein out so it's pure fat. Pure fat preserves pretty well. Fold it up in some animal skins. You have a supply of basically ATP, of energy for maybe months in advance. We learn to dry our meats, smoke them, dry them in the wind, ferment them in some cases, and then preserve them. We could put them in the permafrost and freeze them. So that gave us a more steady supply of nutrients that then allowed us to maintain also to some extent a larger brain. And then we evolved better hunting techniques and blah, 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 and then on up the chain. And so we ate this diet, it gave us this bigger brain, and then we used the bigger brain to be able to acquire more food, preserve that food, deactivate more plant toxins, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's so well explained. I love that. And it's interesting because our brains were growing up until a certain point, and now in the last, I want to say it's about 15,000 years, our brains have actually begun shrinking just a little bit. And we look back on what's happened and evolving as hunter-gatherers, we kind of had it pretty good. Like we would just take the food that we needed. We know that, tribes nowadays, the ones that are still remaining on the earth, they don't work a lot to sustain themselves. They don't have to do a lot of toiling or whatever, even in some of the harshest climates of the earth. And that could be evidence for what was happening in the past, that maybe we didn't work nearly as hard to find foods. But for some reason, we had this deviation in what we decided to do as a species, where we started to domesticate grasses and we became, as you mentioned earlier, agriculturists. I know this is speculative. I don't think anywhere there's any way to know why, but in your opinion, do you have an idea of why we kind of started to gradually switch about 10 to 15,000 years ago, where we were hunter gatherers primarily, and again over a gradual shift became more agriculturalists?
Everybody's debating that question. Nobody has really answered the question and won the prize yet. There's some interesting things to consider that most people don't know. That agricultural was basically born in the Levant, in the Middle East, in a specific region of the Middle East. And the Middle East was actually inhabited by humans, something like 20, 30, 40,000 years before the agricultural revolution. And the fossil records and other records indicate that they were actually eating these grasses and legumes and perhaps even beans that were later domesticated. They were also hunting the animals that were later domesticated. The first ones were sheep and goats. And then this is during the Ice Age. And then there's evidence to show that during one of the warming periods of the Ice Age, that they actually settled into villages and became sedentary. They lived in the same place year round. And they probably, perhaps, were doing some rudimentary forms of farming. They were taking grass seeds and throwing them around their camp, on fertile ground. They didn't weed them or anything, but that's a source of fuel and energy, et cetera, et cetera. And then it got cold again. Those villages went away. Everybody became nomadic again. Population shrank, less food, the whole thing. So agriculture emerged at the same time as a warming period in the overall temperature of the earth. I mean, some people say that we're not even out of the Ice Age. We're just in a warming period of the Ice Age.
I've heard that. I've heard that.
But we define it as the Holocene. And we're 10,000 years into the Holocene. And so basically back then, these people were already familiar with all these plants and animals that they were later domesticate. It got warm, and then agriculture started. But why? Why didn't it start more fully at an earlier period and another warming period in the Ice Age? Why did it take so long? I mean, it's a really complicated question. One possible answer, this is kind of my own little pet theory, is that fatty animals live in colder environments, right? Because they got to store more fat. They have longer, colder periods where food is not available. They have to store more fat for insulation and for fuel during cold periods. So if you're living in the Middle East and it's colder and you got fatty animals around, you hunt the fatty animals, you got globs of fat, that's your source of fuel. But then it starts getting really warm and all your animals start getting really skinny. Your fat goes away and then you're like, oh my God, what am I going to eat? Well, I got all these grains around, but they're wild and they're scattered and they're far out. How am I going to access those to feed everybody that I want to feed? And then someone says, well, hey, why don't we just start doing this farming thing? And then they take their pre-existing knowledge of these plants and then apply it. And then one little innovation leads to another innovation. And then finally, I think it's Jericho. Jericho, they built like the first walled village.
Yeah.
And that's when agriculture and domestication really started to flourish after that. And I would say that probably one of the, you probably have to solve quite a few problems to agriculture. One is that, let's just say you live out in the wild and you got your little farm there, and then you think this is great, and you're waiting for your crop to mature, and you're going to get all this food, and then your neighbor comes along and steals all your food.
Right.
In the middle of the night, right? And you're like, oh man, why in the hell would I waste my time doing this again? So agriculture would have to come hand in hand probably with the ability to protect what you're growing, which would mean walled villages, basically defenses, even almost like very rough versions of standing armies to some extent. Then another thing to consider about agriculture is that generally humans don't want to convert to agriculture. And there's many anecdotal stories about, when the Europeans or whoever would contact foragers and they would think, well, gee, our life is so much better. These foragers are going to want to come over and live with us. And what they found is that they didn't at all. And that instead, as Benjamin Franklin frequently said, the Europeans would want to go live, in this case, with the Native Americans, because they thought life was so much better. The European life was a life of toil, basically eating shitty food, being drunk most of the time, and being conscripted into armies, living in, dirty neighborhoods, and et cetera. And all these people were living still this, what seems to me like a pretty beautiful life.
Ah, agreed. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that explanation. I know a lot of it is speculative, but I had never made the connection between the temperature and the dietary change. That does make a lot of sense, especially when you consider, the biomass of how many large fatty animals there used to be on the planet that has just declined and declined over time. It's very interesting. And again, I really appreciate that explanation. This is just like an absolute flyby of your book, man. We definitely recommend that people go out and grab this. But if you had a few minutes to kind of explain again some of the core takeaways. You have a whole chapter of this at the end where you say like these are some of the takeaways you'd want somebody to have. What would you want the listener of this conversation to walk away with a few practical to do items that they could apply in their lives to again like the book ensues like we want to live in our modern world and enjoy our iPhones and our air conditioning, but also remember what makes us human, what got us here.
Yeah, awesome question. So I'd say first, just start with the theory. Um, Evolution, all that is based on scientific methodology. I respect that people don't want to see evolution as our origins, that maybe they want to choose a more religious perspective. But with that being said, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. It is consistent. It's developed over 150 years. It's on multiple levels, genetic, DNA, narrative. We can even observe it happening to some extent. So it's a real thing, whatever your religious take on it. And then realize that that's largely what designed you. And if you understand that, you can largely increase the quality of your life. Rule number one. And then when we apply the chapters of this book, Circadian Rhythms, well, there's a long, interesting story that we tell that's very fascinating about how circadian rhythms develop and how they evolved over time and how we got there and how we got here. But the takeaway message is that sleep is very important, especially because we're large-brained. And we need good sleep to help our brain recover every day. And when we lose that sleep, our brain does not recover that well, and that can, lead you to problems. And that this modern day affliction of insomnia and sleep disruption didn't really exist in the past when people were living with their natural circadian rhythms. So take your sleep seriously. There's going to be some variation about what time you want to go to bed and what time you want to wake up, but it's generally a pretty good idea to go to sleep about the same time every night. Sleep in a comfortable bed that's dark. If you really want to go into it, there's biohackers out there who will, tell you to sleep in a bed that's like heated at a constant temperature, that's got this kind of pillow and that kind of pillow. If you want to take it to that level, then great. Not necessarily my thing. And then wake up at a fairly consistent time and try to wake up with sunlight. That is light coming into your window. And then, like some people, I don't know the research on this, but when I first wake up, I do like a little bit of what maybe is an alpha theta kind of thing. I'm kind of in a meditative state, and sometimes it's a little disruptive and chaotic, but sometimes I'll actually review the events of the day ahead, what I'm supposed to do, and I get like this clarity. So I might kind of like lounge around in bed for 15 or 20 minutes in this kind of alternate state halfway between waking and sleeping. But then, sooner or later I kick in, wake up, go right outside, take my walk direct into the sunlight. So wake up, get that sunlight, get a little physical activity. There's other ways that you can stimulate they're basically called stress hormones, but they're good stress hormones, things that wake you up and activate you. There's a lot of talk about hot showers, cold showers, doing intense physical activity early in the morning. that kind of thing, that just, wow, you're woken up and you're ready to go. So that's the takeaway on circadian rhythms. Another takeaway on basically work and rest is that you're not designed to work all the time. You're designed basically to put forth, intense focus and concentration on things, and then to need to recover. And if you're just working too much and you're focused all the time, it seems like it tends to trend you towards disease sooner or later. It probably depends on a lot of factors, like how rewarding your work is. I mean, if your work is great, I mean, Elon Musk famously works, he says 10 or 12 hours a day, every day. But I mean, he's the hero of the world, so he's got a great job. But, for the rest of us, I mean, my work is, anyway, but whatever. But for most of us who are just doing regular work, there's only so much we can do, and then we got to replenish and restore, and you got to respect that cycle. And what that cycle probably depends on each person. But for me, it's basically I work in 90-minute blocks. I try to, I can do 2 or 3 hours of 2 or 3 sessions of hyper-focused work in 90-minute blocks. And then after that, I can do easy work, administrative stuff, emailing, meetings, that kind of thing. If I push it, yeah, it shows the next day. I'm kind of a little bit like I can't really focus. When I work through the weekends, for me, it's a bad idea because the following week it just feels murky. So that's circadian rhythms, work patterns. When we get into food and nutrition, which is your specialty, the book basically recommends sort of a generalized diet that people can then tailor a little bit. But starting out, it recommends protein, as I've seen you say in some of your own videos, as being sort of more or less the focus of your meal. Because if you undereat protein, there's a tendency to overeat the other macronutrients and then gain weight and start trending yourself toward the diseases of civilization. And we generally recommend about 80% complete proteins, which is eggs, dairy, meat, soy. Also, you can combine plant proteins like basically grains and legumes to get complete proteins. Plant proteins do not digest as well. They also have storage proteins in them. The protein is sometimes more difficult to access, so you really want to sort of pre-digest those plant proteins as much as possible. So 80% completes, and then 20% collagen, which can come from just eating chicken skin, eating chicken joints. Some animals like squid, shrimp, shellfish are a bit higher in collagen than others. There's collagen supplements. I don't really recommend supplements. I confess that I use them, but I don't recommend them. And then broth, probably the best way. So that's your protein. And you only need so much. And if you overeat protein, all that's going to happen is that your body's going to convert it into ketones and the glucose. If you undereat protein, then you're going to slow down your metabolism, and then you're going to start pulling from your muscles. So you want to find that right balance. And generally it's around, there's debate back and forth, but somewhere around 15% of your total calories. And that's generally around 1.0 to 1.23 grams of protein per kilogram of weight. And then carbs, you don't need a lot. I mean, I think that's where we're kind of agreeing with each other, Casey. It sounds like you're avoiding them altogether. And my message is, well, you don't really need a lot because there's really only two tissues in your body that prefer glucose. One is your brain, the other is your red blood cells. And studies have shown that generally your brain uses about 150 grams of glucose per day. Red blood cells about 20 or 30. I think there are a few other minor tissues that also use glucose. So the other thing is that other nutrients in our body convert to glucose. Like when you eat fat, you're mostly eating triglycerides, and the thing that holds the triglycerides together, I think it's called glycerol, converts into glucose. So when you're eating fat, you're actually getting some amount of glucose. So, but given all that, you generally need about 100 grams of glucose per day to maybe 200. Maybe some people want to eat more. But then at some point, it starts probably to get unhealthy. And especially when those carbs are refined. And it does seem, based on all the evidence, that the most harmful part of the modern diet is refined carbs eaten in excess, raising blood sugar, this causing oxidation, glycation, lipogenesis. It kind of jams up your cells. They're trying to suck the glucose out of your blood to normalize it so you don't uptake fat, and things just start getting weird and going awry. And then, so eat your carbs, whole fruits, whole grains, tubers, whole tubers. And generally, I recommend that you treat whole grains in some way. You soak them, sprout them, ferment them. I eat about 70% of my whole grains that way. And then fats. So most people don't know this, but your body basically runs on fat. So when you're in basal metabolism, resting, your brain is burning glucose, so are your red blood cells. But all your muscles, which are at a low level of activity, are still burning a little bit of fat in the background. Your organs, which are very metabolically demanding tissues, are mostly burning fatty acids. It's what they prefer. And then you're also burning fatty acids when you're doing moderate levels of exercise, walking around, doing housework, hiking, jogging. At some point, when you intensify, you start burning more glucose. But at these lower levels, you're burning fatty acids. And fatty acids are important for that reason, for maintaining a healthy metabolism. And then there's a question of, what ratio to eat your fatty acids, like how much saturated, how much mono, polyunsaturated. That's a long story. I kind of feel like maybe I'm talking a little bit too much at this point. I could
This is
go
great.
into that. But you want to start, if you're thinking about fats, you probably want to start as the basis with your polyunsaturates, because they are essential. That means your body can't make them, and you need to get them from your diet. And if you're not getting them from your diet, you're going to trend yourself towards various afflictions. It's not a real big concern because they're pretty prevalent. But you generally want to get enough, and then you want to get them in the right ratio. That's the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. So generate a foundation of eating enough polyunsaturates and eating them in the proper ratios. There's more guidance on that in the book. I generally do that from eating not vegetable oils. I eat some, but not many of those. So I get my polyunsaturates from nuts, pumpkin seeds. You can get the omega-3s from flax and other things. And then I get the longer chain omega-3s from cod liver oil, which I take every day, and eating seafood, which is one of my favorite foods. And then this whole question of like how much saturated fat you eat, monounsaturated, I'd say generally just, I think the lipid hypothesis has some value to it. I've heard you talk about it, Casey. I don't think you should ignore it altogether, but I don't think I mean, it's 100 years later and it's still a hypothesis. I mean, it's 150 years later. It's not proven, it's a hypothesis still, but it's a very prevalent hypothesis. Uh, and some people say, well, all you should eat is monos and polys, and that will give you a leg up against heart disease. You know, I'm a little on that. I'm like, man, that's weird. I wouldn't do that. I don't think that's such a good idea. There's a long story on that. So I just say generally, you know, eat a little bit of saturated fat and probably eat a bit more monounsaturated fat from olive oil and nuts. And then other people might have different opinions on that. To be honest, it's the most confusing part of my research is less the amount of fat in the diet, but more of the ratios of the fat in the diet and what is best and what is optimum and does it matter?
Yeah, that's a great point.
But I'll tell you some interesting stories about that. Like take herders, modern day herders living in Africa, even to some extent Mongolians. All these people have been studied. They live off sheep or cattle and their dairy. So their diet is, and they eat very few carbs. So their diet is like 60%, potentially 60% saturated fatty acids, including the most hypercholesterolemic of those fatty acids called palmitate or palmititic acid. No heart disease, multiple groups of people across the globe living basically on saturated fat with no evidence of heart disease. Even in our own culture, there's several meta-analyses out there studying people who eat a lot of butter. They can't find butter is like the most hypercholesterolemic of all fats because it's so abundant in saturated fat and so abundant in palmitate. They can't find a correlation between heart disease and butter. Same for red palm oil, which I use. You know, tallow and lard hasn't been studied so much, so I don't really know on that. But then nonetheless, you know, as you've said on some of your videos, LDL lowers bad cholesterol, and this supposedly trends you towards heart disease. There's several mechanisms, and there is evidence actually kind of supporting that. But it's confusing. And I'm still a little confused about it myself.
No worries. You're not alone.
Yeah,
not alone.
I futz around with, I'm still futz around with my dietary fatty acid ratios, but generally I'm probably about 40% monounsaturated, 30% saturated, and then in the 20 to 30% polyunsaturated. My omega-6 to 3 ratio is probably somewhere around 6 to 1. You know, none of this is constant, of course, because I don't control my diet to that extent. I'm not that,
Sure.
you know, freakish about it, but that's kind of generally where I try to stay.
Got it. Well, that was a really great explanation. I think anybody could apply that and have amazing health. And again, as we talked about before, with everybody being so different with genetic backgrounds, you may want to tweak that one way or another. But I think that was a great explanation. And this has been an amazing conversation, Luke. I could talk about this for hours and hours. I love this subject. This has been fantastic. Very much looking forward to the other books coming out in the future sometime. But for now, On the Origin of Being, coming out June 2024. Congratulations to you for writing it. You did a great job. I love the graphs in it, and the concepts you explained in there are really awesome. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work and pick up the book?
So I would say recommend going to the website ontheoriginsofbeing.com. From there, you'll see social media links. Thus far, Jenny Powers, my co-author, is running social media and doing a great job. We're getting the most activity on Instagram right now, but we just started a month or two ago, so we're low in numbers. Don't let that indicate to you that we're low in interest. It's just that we're first starting out, but we love followers, we love support. And then we're also on Facebook, and I confess I've been out of the social media world for a while, but I'm contemplating opening my own account
Oh man.
to address this book and other issues. And I'm trying, you have any recommendations on which platform I should use?
No, I don't at all. No. If you've gotten off of it, I would have a very hard time getting back on it. On the note of like followers, I only have like 50 followers on my Instagram because my original account got hacked. So I'm starting from scratch as well. So
Oh,
I,
goodness.
I totally understand.
Yeah, so wow. But yeah, I feel like I can make valuable contributions to social media at this point. So I'm trying to figure it out.
Cool. Well, that's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the show notes. Luke, this has been an amazing conversation. Like I said, I really appreciate you and all the research and a massive amount of research that went into writing this book and all the other materials you offer. If you do make it back to social media, it will be very appreciated by people out there. But for now, thank you so very much for all of your work and thank you for being on our show today. We really appreciate you.
And Casey, I wanted to say likewise, I've looked at your website and your work. And it's nice to connect with people who share a similar worldview, you know, that our health is like the most important thing. And let's pursue that and let's study it and let's understand it to the best of our ability. And I know you've been doing it your whole life with your wife as well. And I really respect that. And I'm so thankful that you've had me on the show. And I would recommend that maybe you bring Jenny on next time.
That would be great. We would love to interview her as well. We'd love to talk to you when your other books come out. Thank you so very much for the kind words. It's really meaningful. And yeah, we definitely share that passion of trying to get this message out there. So thanks again for coming on the show.
Okay, Casey, over and out.
All right. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.